And we are live. What's up, wrestling fans? I am Dynamite Doug.
Notice the name change, and I'm still just plain old Kevin.
I'm totally owning it. You guys are going to call me out on it anyway, so I might as well embrace it. It is what it is. What's happening, Kevin?
Well, Doug, we got a great show this week, one I've been looking forward to, where we are going to talk about some of the greatest matches of all time, in our opinion. And before we get to that, though, Doug, we have news. So,
Well, let's go ahead and hit that opening bell.
all right, and Doug, maybe let's start with the speaking out. If you didn't join us last week, folks, we talked about the speaking out movement that has hit professional wrestling. Which, if you didn't join us, it's essentially the Me Too movement coming to wrestling 2 years late, and so we have a series of allegations. It started as a British wrestling thing, and now it's pretty much engulfed the entire industry. Really isn't fair to just call it a British wrestling problem. Apparently,
Yes.
it is a wrestling problem, Doug, and one that's gone on for in secret for way too long.
It certainly appears to be wrestling's dirty little, I guess, open secret. I wasn't really aware of things like this. And actually, I was listening to Jim Cornette, his podcast last night, where he was talking. He was alluding to Joey Ryan, but was talking about this whole thing in general, and just talking about how in the '80s things like this maybe happened on occasion, but it was like one guy or here or there, and the other guys in the locker room really wouldn't put up with that kind of thing. But he said that was in
And
the
if
'80s, and things have indeed changed, I guess.
though, if you watch like the Dark Side of the Ring series and saw the one on the Fabulous Moolah and what she put supposedly, I guess,
Yes,
allegedly put
allegedly, right?
female. So to a certain extent, this has been part of wrestling culture, dating even that far back. So obviously, it is a reckoning, and it's good to as ugly as all this is going to be. This is probably one of the biggest news stories in recent memory for professional wrestling, and we'll keep following it. Doug and I were talking before we hit the air that just the sheer number of allegations this week, in addition to the denials, either from the wrestlers involved or from their agents or lawyers. It just
And I think we just lost
actionable
Kevin.
items.
Whoa, hey, we lost you there, brother. You got all froze up on us, and
Oh,
I think you're back in action now, though. You're
I'm back
good.
in action. All
You're
right.
you're
Well, what
good.
I was just saying is that this past week we had a lot more in the way of allegations, a lot more in the way of denials. We're just going to get to actionable items, things that's actually
Yes.
changed since last week instead of he said, she said stuff. So NXT UK has parted ways with Travis Banks and Ligaro. Joey Ryan has deleted his Twitter account, and his Bar Wrestling Federation has closed its doors. Dave Christ has gone from Impact Wrestling. Sammy Guevara has apologized to Sasha Banks because of some comments he made on air several years ago that were extremely distasteful about her. He's been suspended without pay by AEW. MLW has released their ring announcer, Mark Haggerty. Chikara is supposedly closed over the scandal because Mike Quackenbush, the owner and head trainer, has had numerous allegations levied at him. And meanwhile, some high-profile names in the industry, folks such as Bailey and Drew McIntyre and Big E and Kofi and Keith Lee have all stepped forward and been speaking out this week on their truths, things they've witnessed in the business, and a call for reform and a support for the victims. So, Doug, did I miss anybody that lost their job this week because
Well, I'm not.
related to speaking out?
I know Michael Elgin has now gone from Impact. I know there
But
were
that
out.
isn't speaking out related.
I was wondering. I'm wondering about that because I know there was an incident backstage with he and Sammy Callahan, but he has also been called out in the speaking out movement. So I wonder if one precipitated the other or vice versa. I'm really not sure how we call the Michael Elgin situation, other than
Maybe that's somewhere in between.
maybe so. I mean, I
And
don't.
speaking of in between, I mean, unless you know of anyone more speaking out, you want to address the other big departure that.
So, and this again is also potentially related to speaking out because I know that Tessa Blanchard had been called out for being a big bully to the to females in the locker room going back several years and having some very distasteful remarks allegedly. So I don't know if this is part of that speaking out. It sounds, however, more like Tessa is just very difficult to work with, and has there have been some problems between her and Impact. And her, actually, I guess in a few days, her contract was going to end with Impact on June 30th, and there was a handshake agreement to get her through Slammiversary where she would drop the belt, but apparently she wasn't interested in that. And during the whole global pandemic, she has been in Mexico with her boyfriend, fiance, and which, like a lot of other wrestlers, and a lot of other promotions are saying, if you're uncomfortable coming in, making the travel arrangements, we understand we're in a global pandemic, we're willing to work with you. But all reports I'm reading and everything I'm seeing on the interwebs say that she wasn't really willing to work. Wasn't up for dropping that belt at Slammiversary, and wasn't even sending in any promos. So Impact just went ahead and severed ties with her a little early, and they stripped her of the title. So Tessa Blanchard is out of Impact and out of wrestling for the time being, unless somebody else picks her up soon.
So Slammiversary is considered like the WrestleMania in Impact's calendar. So it is their big show. They had put a lot into Tessa Blanchard. She is the first female to not only hold a historically men's championship. She's not the women's champion, folks, if you don't watch Impact. She is actually the main champion of the organization. So they had her positioned as, they're John Cena. They're, right now they're
Drew McIntyre is what he was going to say there. I think we just lost him again, though. So, and he's just kind of frozen, and he looks really happy froze like that. But anyway, yeah, Tessa Blanchard was the Impact champion, and she is no longer the champion. I'm going to go ahead and kick Kevin and see if we can get him back here in just a minute. We're live TV, nothing quite like it. There we go. He's back, but we can't hear him. There we go. Now we can hear him. I kicked you out and brought you back in, brother. All right. So we lost you at Drew McIntyre, I think.
Well,
but I was going on.
Yeah.
I kind of tried to pick up the ball and run with you, how you're explaining the significance of Tessa Blanchard in Impact and how much they've invested in her. But, I was already reading this morning that, other unnamed, but other promotions are already interested in her. I'm wondering if AAA, since she's actually in Mexico right now, may be knocking at her door.
I'd heard that WWE had come calling, but see, at one point she had a contract with NXT, and she was considered difficult to work with back then, so she didn't end up getting signed. And it's worth pointing out, I guess we should point out, since we are trying to cover the speaking out movement, again, this could tangibly be related, but one of the reasons why, even though she's generally considered probably the best, if not one of the best, at least at the very least, female wrestlers in the world, why an AEW or WWE might not touch her right now especially is that she had some allegations levied against her not that long ago. I know you mentioned the bullying in general, but specifically Allison Kay, who used to be Sienna in Impact and is now Allison Kay in NWA, alleged that in the locker room she overheard a conversation between a black female performer and Tessa, where Tessa levied the N-word at the performer, and Black Rose is the name of the performer, and she verified that did in fact happen. So with AEW taking that hard stance against, like, Hulk Hogan and such, saying that they would never be welcome there, they would be hard, even though they're, Tessa's father works for the company, they would be pretty hard pressed, I think, to bring her in right now, considering those ugly allegations. So tough week.
Very tough week, and we haven't even got to how the pandemic has been affecting WWE this week, and really AEW by extension of something that happened in WWE world.
Let me mention one more departure, Doug.
All right.
Zicky Dice has asked for his release from NWA. The National Wrestling Alliance has also been having a very difficult time through all this, just not because of losing their vice president to the allegations with speaking out, but Zicky asked for his release. NWA is reportedly granting the release and offering any release to any talent who doesn't believe in their vision moving forward. And they've been in such shambles that they have produced no new TV in the last 2 weeks. And as you and I have covered on here, they have been one of the ones regularly posting things to their YouTube channels.
Yes.
And so right now that whole federation is in flux. But yeah, the coronavirus also still out there, if you want to talk about some of the impacts of that.
So jumping from Impact to WWE, apparently, from what reading and understanding, is at least one WWE performer was found positive for coronavirus, which rapidly ramped up to almost 2 dozen at their tapings last week. One of those, some of the on-air talent that I've mentioned, there's been no in-ring talent, and I've also seen other people covering that there's strict issues, a strict word from the above for the folks not to mention that they are COVID positive at this point. This is just for the in-ring performers, but we have on-camera performers such as Renee Young. What's the guy's name? The bald guy. He's a producer. You see him breaking up fights all the time.
Oh, the guy used to be NWA champion.
Anyway,
That guy.
that guy. But Renee Young is the big name there because she's an announcer for WWE, but her husband is the AEW champion John Moxley. And if you're watching AEW this week, you will notice that Moxley was not on air, and Tony Khan addresses this. Moxley came in contact with someone who was COVID positive, and Doc Samson said it was best for him to just stay home this week. And then later we find out Renee Young is saying, yes, what a week, I lose my job because WWE Backstage was canceled this week and she's COVID positive. So she's having a rough week all around.
Dovetailing off that, Doug, for those who don't know, and you're like, okay, Backstage is canceled, so what? There's actually many reasons why that's a big deal, more so than just Backstage being canceled. If you never watched it, it was a talk show. It was sort of a sports discussion type program that aired on FS1. And the three reasons why this is big news is, first, it was part of that agreement that brought SmackDown to network television. When WWE came to Fox, part of that agreement was to expand its profile across the FS networks. It was also intended as a star vehicle for Renee, which is one of the reasons why she was removed from the broadcast team of Raw. It also provided for the return of CM Punk, who many thought would never be in WWE again. Well, he wasn't, even though he kind of was. This arrangement had him employed by Fox and not by WWE. Now, supposedly some in WWE never really cared for the pot shots that Punk would take, because he gave a very unvarnished opinion on the product, and he seemed to be enjoying it. And it was nice to see that sort of honesty in a WWE-related product based on itself. So for those three reasons alone, this spells some trouble for all those involved. Who knows what CM Punk's status is going to be with professional wrestling moving forward, what role they find for Renee. And honestly, Doug, what does this portend for SmackDown if ratings don't improve on the main network, if they lose their show on FS1?
Exactly. We're going to have, and ratings seem to be really shaky anyway. What we're going to see is less pushing of new stars. We're going to see, guaranteed draws, and what Vince McMahon and Bruce Pritchard see as guaranteed draws showing up across all brands to bump the ratings, especially during this COVID time. And I haven't actually circled back around and watched SmackDown yet, but it sounded like it was a big love letter to the Undertaker. But at least the people in the audience this week had masks on, so I guess that's a positive.
So I'm wondering, Doug, if the reason that I thought it was odd. If you didn't watch SmackDown, folks, like Doug hasn't had a chance to yet, the first hour, they replayed the entire Boneyard match in its entirety and did do this love letter thing to The Undertaker, showed his first appearance in WWE. And that was the first hour. I thought that was the whole episode. And then the second hour was more like a regular show. So I am wondering if with them being a little cagey about how many of their talent have actually tested positive, if that was all they had available is to produce an hour's worth of television, and they filled out the other hour with this Undertaker stuff that was not really advertised previously. Mm-hmm. So I think it might have been a situation where they had to punt.
Yes, I was wondering about that. Again, I haven't watched it yet, so I really can't comment on other than what I've seen covered on YouTube and read on a couple of the sheets. But it definitely sounded like a love letter to Undertaker, and I'm presuming, like you are, that they probably had to call an audible here just to work with the talent that they had.
And Doug, that is the week that was, at least in a nutshell, and we will continue following because, folks, we know it's not we're somewhere still close to the beginning of the whole speaking out movement and what the ramifications are. If even half of those that have been accused end up being found guilty of something, we'll be reporting. I would think throughout the entire summer on releases on almost a weekly basis. But Doug, if you don't have any more news, we
Man,
got fun stuff to talk about. Let's
I
get the
am
fun stuff.
I am done with the news. Let's head to the main event, brother. Let's do this.
Main event time. So, folks, as we had been advertising for the last few weeks, we are going to talk about the best matches of all time. At WWE's last pay-per-view, they advertised the greatest wrestling match ever in advance of the Edge Orton contest, and we hated on the promotion because the promotion of the match. In general, overall, the match itself got pretty good reviews. In fact,
Except
some
for me.
raves, except for Doug. He was one of the rare regulars, but I mean, honestly, there was no way it was going to be the greatest match of all time. But what it really was more a concept of what it is to love this business. It had the elements of what we think of and what we enjoy about wrestling and the greatest matches of all time. And it made Doug and I think about how, to us, what are some of those moments? There is no greatest match of all time. That's why it couldn't be, because it's like saying what's the greatest song of all time. That is very subjective. And before we really get into our list, Doug, since this is subjective, I'm curious, what were some of the criteria you used when you were coming up with your list? Because I'll tell you a little bit about mine in a minute.
So mine really was pretty simple because I just look back through wrestling and realized this was kind of odd though, because I realized that there's an entire generation of wrestling fans out there who've really known nothing as far as a major brand other than WWE. I mean, WCW went down right around 2000. So, there's 20 years of almost 20 years of WWE dominance. But, I look back through my childhood and, there was one particular match I remember from my childhood and the wrestlers that, I just looked for stuff that really made me pop. I couldn't find the match I was looking for. Because I'm sure it was just on a Saturday morning. There was nothing grandiose about it or anything, but I think it's one of those that really got me into wrestling. Just because I still remember the major move that got me out. There was a wrestler named Mike Doggendorf, I believe, old NWA wrestler, and I remember the guy he was wrestling with goes for a pin, and he just presses him up and off of him and throws the guy, and I just completely popped for that as a kid. And of course I'm a big Steamboat Youngblood fan, Jay Youngblood fan from way back. So I just looked for stuff that made me pop. But the more I went through the list, I thought it would probably be better for us to reference things that not are stuck somewhere here in my mind and you have to do deep dives into YouTube on. So I tried to find some things a bit more closer to the here and now, or at least that are easily accessible to everybody.
Dude, I'm glad that you talked about the match that got you into it, because really, when I started looking at how do I narrow it down? Now, we're going to first start with some honorable mentions and then get to some of our matches that would actually make our list. But there's no wonder you can't pick the greatest match of all time, because it is really, at the end of the day, it might not be that WrestleMania main event. It might have been something you saw on a Saturday morning as a kid. You might, I noticed that with a lot of mine, they are on the big stages, because sometimes it is about that moment, the match that meant something for a title, for a main event of a WrestleMania or a Starrcade or one of the big, But sometimes it is literally, it could have been the best match you all ever saw. If you're watching this, it might have been something you saw at your local gym as a kid, and that just really got you into this sport. It's not always about the technical brilliance. I started thinking about, how many matches, that I've seen lately that are just the athleticism today is so far beyond what it was when we were, first got into it as a kid. And then you look back even the generation before us. If you look at a Bruno Sammartino match or a Buddy Rogers match or Jack Briscoe match or something, these folks won't, a fan today will go back and look at that and not understand what the fuss is about. So in some ways, another reason why you can't have the greatest match of all time is the greatest match of the 1960s and the greatest match of today is going to be so different. 20 years from now, you and I are going to look back at whatever, we had as our match of the year this year and probably feel the same way as far as just how the sport evolves and changes. So what I try to look for me is those matches that made me feel something. It wasn't just technically brilliant. It might be, whatever is at the end of this show when we go for our match of the week, I guarantee you has more technical brilliance in it than what Andre versus Hogan had at WrestleMania 3. Those guys couldn't really work, but that stage, 80,000 plus, the significance of Andre Lou, all of that. Sometimes it is more than just the match itself that makes a great spectacle of professional wrestling. And so I tried to get a mix as best I could. And hopefully you guys chime in. If you remember some of these matches, or if you have some of your own, let us know about it. Doug, you want to get into some honorable mentions on your list first? Because that's kind of
You
the way
know
I got
what?
mine
I
set
know
up.
we talked about honorable mentions, but I could go on and on about this. It was difficult enough for me to knock it down to five, and I had some in my mind ahead of time. I stuck with just five, from my end. I'm wondering if we actually overlap with anything, but you go ahead with your honorable mentions because I backed off of honorable mentions. I just wanted a straight five to work with through this.
I'm going to just list the honorable mentions. I'm not going to talk about them the way I am my actual matches. So honorable mentions include Steamboat Savage stealing the show from Hogan Andre at WrestleMania 3, Flair and Sting at the first Clash of the Champions, Triple H versus Mick Foley or Cactus Jack at the time at the Royal Rumble in 2000, Flair Michaels at WrestleMania and Flair's retirement match, CM Punk and John Cena at Money in the Bank 2011, Sasha Banks and Bayley at TakeOver in Brooklyn, and then Tommaso Ciampa and Johnny Gargano at NXT TakeOver in Chicago.
Let me just say, two of your honorable mentions made my list.
Well, we get to talk about them after all. Go number one on your list, Doug. We'll go back and forth if that works for you.
So we'll go ahead and go ahead with Bayley and Banks at TakeOver Brooklyn in 2015 because this match to me, I mean, like I say, it's those matches. First of all, there's the storytelling. You have this great story of a great heel versus face there with Bayley and Banks, and then knowing how tight all of the four horsewomen are behind the scenes, going into it, these girls stole the show. I mean, there was a match after their they weren't actually the main event that night, but I don't even remember who followed. I think it was Balor and was it Balor and Owens that followed it? I don't even remember. I just that was the main event. Yeah. And that's unfortunate, but I mean, my God, these girls killed it that night. They totally established this is what women can do in the business. Just the psychology of working Bayley, stomping, when Bayley's in a bank statement and she's reaching for the ropes and Sasha's stomping on her injured hand, try and pull her back. And I don't know what the move is called, but it's early in the match where Bayley's on the outside and there's a ref that's through the ropes, checking on her. Sasha comes through over top of the ref and hits her. From the inside out. It's things like that just really make me pop as a wrestling fan. And I can't believe you just made an honorable mention on your list, man.
Hey, trying to narrow it down, like you said.
I know. That's why I said, I do five and I'm done.
That's why at first I had on our format sheet when I was trying to three. I'm like, no, I can't do three, and then five, and then all right, I got to add honorable mentions because how do I leave this match out or that match out? I honestly think that the match that you just mentioned is the greatest women's match of all time. And kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about sometimes it's not just the match. The match itself was fantastic, but the significance of this match. Both these ladies are on the developmental brand at the time, not considered the main brand.
Right.
The women's evolution had not yet hit the main roster or women's wrestling in the industry. This match could not only be seen as a great match, this match could legitimately be looked at as the match that changed women's wrestling from what it had been before, which was an objectification and a not taken seriously as real athletes. And these ladies not only stole the show, they changed the business. And I don't think that's hyperbole to say that one match could have definitely been the chain reaction for everything that's come after.
Absolutely. So first, what you got on yours?
I went chronologically. So
okay,
for me,
I'm in no particular order, but okay, chronologically. What do you got?
Of course you're in no order ever. I'm just, I'm happy to hear a non-AEW one on your list. I'm like, whoa, really? The 5 best matches of all time I thought was in the last year to you.
All on Dynamite.
All on Dynamite. So for me, I have to get this in. I try to get a little bit from, obviously, like I said, the modern era, athletically speaking, is so far beyond what hooked us to begin with. But I could not do a list without Flair versus Steamboat. and you could almost take your pick, folks. They wrestled each other in the 70s, they wrestled each other in the 90s, but the series of matches they had for the world title in the late 80s is considered probably the best series of matches in the history of the sport. Flair was the consummate champion. Steamboat was the consummate babyface. They faced off at Chi-Town Rumble in February of '89 in Chicago. Steamboat pinned Flair to capture his first ever NWA World title. They met again at Clash of the Champions on April 2nd, and that is the match that I'm going to list because they had a third one that was also great, probably maybe even the best of the three. But when I was a kid, I didn't get the pay-per-views. There wasn't, I don't even know if I had access at that
Right.
time to a pay-per-view if I wanted to. But Clash of the Champions, they ran Clash of the Champions 6 on April 2nd opposite WrestleMania 5, and they gave it for free. And because they gave it for free, this little kid who is used to seeing nothing but squash matches got to see the two best of all time, that generation for certain, two of the best of all time. Face off in a 2 out of 3 match, 2 out of 3 falls match. They went for an hour, and Flair ended up regaining the belt by decision. We had some folks at ringside: Luthez, Pat O'Connor, Terry Funk sitting ringside to serve as official judges. And it left it made such an impact on me. I was already a fan, but that's what really sealed the deal for me to be obsessive within this industry. And I was almost tempted to list the Flair Steamboat match as one I saw. In West Virginia, of all places, they had, believe it or not, Flair Steamboat had a match at the high school there. I sat front row. I was maybe 13, 14 years old. They went Broadway. They did an hour, probably an hour, 10, 15 minutes, because I think the timekeeper fell asleep trying to, he was so into the match that he lost track of the time, because I was looking at a watch and they went longer than an hour. Either that or it's just my kid's mind telling me they did, because it seemed like they wrestled forever. And that was the greatest match I ever saw in person. So Flair Steamboat, you all can take your pick which one is the better of those. But if you haven't seen any of them, go back. Younger fans, go back and learn.
Right. So it's funny because, another match you mentioned is your honorable mention is on my list, and Flair Steamboat, 2 out of 3 falls, April 2nd, Clash of Champions 6 is on my list. So for all the reasons you just mentioned. I think you are hard pressed to go back through and find one, but for that one, it's me. And you have the finish, but you have Flair whose foot was on the rope. So even though Steamboat wins, it sets up their rubber match down the line too. So, but
that's hilarious that with all the matches in history, Doug, how could we have, when we're limiting it to 5, pick the same ones?
And I'll say that there are 2 wrestlers that on my list that make my list twice. And so I'm just going to go ahead and jump into my next one because you mentioned Savage and Steamboat at WrestleMania 3. Again, I think that was another show stealer. You had, Andre Hogan on that card too, but just like Bayley and Sasha at that NXT takeover, that was the showstopper, the show stealer at that WrestleMania. You got your class again, Ricky Steamboat, huge Ricky Steamboat fan from way, way back. I know I talk about Ricky Steamboat and Jay Youngblood all the time when I was a little kid, watching wrestling. I think that might be where my love of tag team wrestling comes from, actually. But big fan of Ricky Steamboat from way, way back. And it's one of those matches because when I was younger, I don't even know that I had access to WWE programming for a very, very long time. I could get the stuff coming out of the South, the territories that would broadcast, in syndication, but I don't really even remember even having access to like USA Network programming till much, much later. I want to say maybe even high school. So this match I didn't get to see back then, and again, like you're saying, I'm not sure if we even had pay-per-view access or where we came up back in the day. But this is one of those I've went back and watched a few times, and it's just from bell to final count. It's another great one to get out there with. But Steve,
it definitely shows what we're missing today, because that crowd, that 80,000 people roaring at every false finish back in a time when you didn't see, like now we see a lot of that.
Yes.
1, 2, 2.5, and then multiple. Back in the day, you didn't really see that, Doug. Usually, you hit your finisher, and that
Right.
was going to be it. And so these guys, like we were talking with Bailey and Sasha, that is a match that could be looked at in even today's modern athleticism terms, and you could see the seeds in that work that those two guys did.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. But yeah, Steamboat with Flair and Steamboat with Savage, are both on my list. So I'm curious to see how many of our others cross over, because there is another wrestler that's on my list twice.
I have a feeling that we haven't seen our last one that we may, as we've mentioned before, folks, we don't ahead of time tell the other one what we're going to do other than the general format of the show. So we'll see if we cross paths again, but it doesn't surprise me about those older ones, Doug, because
Right.
like you said, we had a certain amount of access at the time, and the stuff that really hooks you when you're young, that stays with you forever. So those matches
Absolutely.
are going to stick with us in our memories. So that, I can picture the two of us as kids watching on that same night and being enthralled at that first Clash of the Champions like that, or not the first, but the fifth.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So my next one,
What you got?
I'm jumping way forward here now. We're going from the 80s into the 90s. Stone Cold versus The Rock, WrestleMania 17. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about time and place being important in a contest, because I know I've seen plenty of matches that were more technically sound than this match between The Rock and Stone Cold, but this one was the headliner of what, to me, I still believe is the best WrestleMania of all time. There wasn't a bad match on the card, but listen to this. If you don't remember, this started out Jericho versus Regal was the opening match. It had Angle versus Benoit, Shane versus Vince, Undertaker versus Triple H, that classic TLC that everyone remembers between the Dudleys and Edge and Christian and the Hardys. Think of all of that. And yet, even with all of that, it would have been one of the greatest WrestleManias ever. You put on top of that the two biggest stars of the era, two of the biggest stars of all time that happen to be wrestling at the same era of time, and you put them in a world title match at the head of one of your biggest shows ever. And so time and place elevated this match beyond what happened in the ring itself, but they were perfect opposites. They were just made for each other. These two icons, they were perfect foils. Looking back, I can quibble perhaps about the turn where Austin joins McMahon. Now that you think about it in their history, it's like, does that make a world of sense? Maybe not. But in that moment, in front of that hot crowd, the two biggest icons of that era, and again, beyond just the match itself, you could look at this very realistically as that was in many ways the end of the Attitude Era, which was the most lucrative and most watched era in the history of professional wrestling. And those are the two biggest names to come out of it. And this was the end of not only their story together, really, but the end of that whole era of professional wrestling.
And there's some really, really great build, getting us to that point of that match. I mean, just I mean, you've got two guys that are great on the mic, great in the ring, building and building and building to this final confrontation there. This is definitely a good one. I mean, you talk about all this other stuff, and there's like, man, there's so many of those that I could have put on my list, and just from that WrestleMania.
Yeah,
you
that
know
WrestleMania is sick, folks. If you have not seen that WrestleMania, I mean, nowadays we're so used to 7-8 hour WrestleManias
Oh
that
my
there's
goodness.
no
Yeah.
way in the world it's going to sustain throughout all that. It's just not built to anymore. That was a tight 3.5 or so hour show
Right.
where every match on that show meant something, and every match either delivered or over delivered. Unbelievable WrestleMania. And then to top it off with those two, they are, sort of the Flair and Steamboat of their age. I mean, as far as being, that was the ultimate opponent for each
Yeah.
of those particular guys, and that was the best match they ever had because it was on the biggest show that they would ever headline. Fantastic.
It really was one. I don't think I'm giving up anything here. No spoilers, but neither both those guys are great performers, but neither one of those have hit my list on my top five anyway. And like I said, I did a solid five and just stepped away because I was it
Step
was
away.
it was nerve wracking, and you know me, I like to revise and edit to no end. So I did it and just stepped away from it because I knew there'd be a lot of discussion and things that I would walk away from and leave on the table. You might possibly bring them up, and this is a great one to bring up.
Good. Good. Well, yeah. What's your next one? Maybe, hopefully, it's one that I wanted to put on mine and didn't.
So let's see. Well, we covered two of mine with Steamboat, so I'll go ahead and get into this. This wrestler also hits mine twice, so I'll go ahead and go with something from actually this year.
Oh,
Um, yeah, so AEW's Revolution pay per view earlier this year, where we had the Young Bucks versus Kenny Omega and Hangman. This by far, the story here is great. I've said over and over time on the show, it is my match of the year for this year. I haven't seen anything better than it this year. I think Meltzer might have even given it a 6 stars for a tag team match, but that's Meltzer. To me, it's a great match from start to finish. What makes it special for me is the interaction and the storytelling that there is throughout the match. The spots are great. The athleticism is amazing. But if you follow being the elite, if you follow AEW, if you follow these guys from New Japan into their own organization, it means a little bit more. But then you just see why these guys can really go. You see why these guys are at the top of their game, and why there's a wrestling company that was actually built around them, with them as executive vice presidents of it. Because when they're in the game, they are in it. And just from bell to final count, an amazing story. And even after the final count, where you've got the tease of a turn there with Hangman on Kenny. It's just great throughout, and it's something they've continued to drag along right now, with the tension between Kenny and Hangman, and really Hangman and the rest of the elite to this day. I think coronavirus has actually slowed that story down a bit, but I'm okay with that. I'm good with the slow burn story, but that's one of my matches, the greatest matches of all time. With I won't tell you which performer, but you can probably guess now.
oh,
I have showed my cards, haven't I?
well, and I'm not going to show mine by saying we're going to repeat, but we may be repeating. Not on my next choice, because I'm going chronologically, so I'm not going to get to. Well, I'm not going to say which performer I think it is, but yeah, I think we're going to have at least two the same. But my next match is moving forward in time. I'm going to WrestleMania 25, and to me, what is still the best WrestleMania match ever. And that's something, Doug, I guess I should note when I go back and look at this list, that I got several matches that can be linked to either WrestleMania or,
Right.
well, I won't give the other card away, but like, again, that big stage sometimes just makes that match mean more than just a throwaway match that you might see on a Saturday that's brilliant, but just has no backstory behind it. This one had the greatest backstory behind it. What you have is, I mean, the story leading up to it is perfect. You have one of the greatest WrestleMania performers ever in the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels, who had already had big stage matches and classics at WrestleMania against Razor Ramon, classic at WrestleMania against his brother Owen. You have the classic 60-minute contest he'd had at WrestleMania against Bret Hart. The classic contest he had at WrestleMania 19 with Chris Jericho. I mean, I'd argue with anybody that despite what The Undertaker has known for at WrestleMania, no one's had better matches at WrestleMania than the Heartbreak Kid himself. Then again, on the other hand, you do have The Undertaker, who has had so many classics and moments at WrestleMania that he got so involved and associated with the event itself that other wrestlers would consider it as much of, if not more of, an honor if they got that Taker match instead of the main event, instead of the world title match.
Mm-hmm.
That's how much Undertaker came to mean to WrestleMania. And so WrestleMania 25 comes along, and you have two of the greatest to ever do it, two of the greatest to be associated with that event, have this one contest, and they would do it again the following year at WrestleMania 26. And even though that was phenomenal in its own right, as great as that was, it pales in comparison to that first WrestleMania contest. For 48 minutes or so, it was back and forth drama with HBK pulling out all the stops. At that point, you almost thought the Taker would never lose at WrestleMania. Obviously, he ended up doing that at one point, but the streak seemed so safe that every year you'd have the match, but you never really thought he was going to lose. HBK this night made me think that, well, maybe that's how close the near falls, the reversals, the using each other's finishers. The crowd was as electric as any I'd ever heard in professional wrestling. I watched this in a room full of other folks, and that room was so loud I could barely hear the announcers on TV because people were on the edge of their seats screaming at the television. Obviously, Doug, maybe a theme here. This one's another one that should have headlined. It didn't.
Right.
Triple H and Orton had to follow that, and both have said in interviews since that was one of the biggest mistakes of their career, is putting themselves on last when there's no way in the world anybody could have followed that WrestleMania contest.
It's so hard to put together a list like this. I think back to when we were at in Columbus a few months ago at that NXT show, and we're outside, and the kids behind us are talking about their WrestleMania or their wrestling Mount Rushmore, and I'm thinking, I have no idea who I would put on my wrestling Mount Rushmore, and then you're like, hey, let's do a greatest matches, and I'm like, oh my god, you're killing me. This is again why I did my 5 and I was done and I walked away, because this is another one that could so easily have been on there. Actually, so many that Shawn Michaels is involved with, like you talking about the Razor Ramon, the ladder matches. There's so much, and I also think about the where he retires Ric Flair, with the I love you, I'm sorry, sweet chin music, and it's done. A great wrestling moment. Iconic.
Yeah, that's the greatest line ever delivered in the professional wrestling ring.
Absolutely. I love you. I'm sorry. Boom. But yeah,
tears coming down Flair's. Yeah, I mean, that's a moment. That's a moment.
So I mean, I'm glad you put Shawn Michaels on here at a match, because again, I was 5 and done, because I would still be mulling over a list if I just didn't stop myself.
Yeah.
But so, yay. Good call.
Thank you, sir. What's your next?
So I think we've had a few overlap here with Steamboat Flair, and I only have one more, which was in 2018. So I'm going fairly recent again.
You want me to go next then? Because I got 2 more. I think we.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I moved from WrestleMania, Doug, to Wrestle Kingdom. Wrestle Kingdom 10. AJ Styles versus Shinsuke Nakamura. WrestleMania is, what it is in this country, but if you're not familiar, folks, with New Japan Pro Wrestling, Wrestle Kingdom is not only that in New Japan Pro Wrestling. Next to WrestleMania, it is on the annual wrestling calendar, generally the best attended, biggest show of the year. And this was the first Wrestle Kingdom that I remember watching. I sought it out specifically so that I could see this match. I had long been an AJ Styles fan. He'd been one of my favorites. He shined in TNA, even during those eras when TNA wasn't very good. He stayed loyal and stayed there forever. He spent so much of his time there, in fact, that for most athletes, those would have been their prime years. So to many folks, he was going to be past his prime just based on age when he left, and took a bet on himself, really. He didn't re-sign with Impact and decided to go try one last time to see if he could get on the WWE stage. And he did so by working and promotions around the world, indies, over in Japan, just to see where it would go. And where it took him was all the way to the top of New Japan Pro Wrestling as their champion, as one of the architects of the Bullet Club, which, at the time especially was the hottest faction since the NWO days and all of professional wrestling. And he was doing all this out of Japan. And at the same time, you have this, have the superstar over there in Shinsuke Nakamura. If you're only familiar with his work in America, folks, you have to go look at his work in New Japan to see the real Shinsuke. Part of the King of Strong Style made it to NXT. It did not make it on to the main roster, unfortunately. And part of that is not just the way he's booked. I mean, he's in his 40s and such now as well. So these 2 men, still in their prime, went on next to last. Again, another match that was not the main event. And it was such a realistic contest. It made me fall in love with the New Japan style, that Japanese strong style. I was so excited about this match that I remember taking the whole New Japan show and putting it on a Fire Stick, Doug, and I don't know if you're on a thumb drive, and bringing it over to your house
Yes,
and saying,
yes.
"You have to see this."
Yes, this is actually what got me into New Japan. Yeah,
Me too.
and I was so excited to know that not only Gallows Anderson, not only AJ were coming to WWE, but Shinsuke as well, because he was the other one that left. There was a bit of an exodus there. The four of them left at the same time, left New Japan.
Right.
Poor
I didn't mention that. You're right. That was a curtain call.
Yeah, poor Gato was left, losing three members of Bullet Club and one member of Chaos there in one fell swoop to Vince McMahon. And you're right, Shinsuke did. We did get to see a little bit of the King of Strong style in NXT, but by the time he got to the main roster, I was thinking, was it a WrestleMania where we had AJ, and
Yes.
that was a WrestleMania, because I was thinking, here it is, we're going to get it in on an American audience now, we're going to see it, and it was
Not
not anything
no,
like that Wrestle Kingdom 10.
no.
No. But that is, and you're right, that was an amazing match, and it really made me stand up and take notice and go, oh, look at that, look at this New Japan stuff, what is this about?
I have a feeling I gave you a segue too.
Yeah, well, if you want me to take it and run with it, I certainly will.
Yep, you go ahead because I think we each have one left, and it may be the same one, Doug. You tell me.
So with Kevin's introduction, introducing me to New Japan, I've ran with it for quite a while, and there became a point in time when I was really disillusioned with WWE programming and just completely dropped the network altogether for a while and picked up the New Japan, I believe it's New Japan World, their streaming service, so I could watch a lot more New Japan, and I became a very big, well, surprise. I mean, we do call me Dynamite Doug now, but a very big fan of Bullet Club, and particularly the Elite and things that were going on at the time in New Japan, which leads me to my 2018 match I was talking about earlier at Dominion on 6/9 of 2018. We had the IWGP Heavyweight Championship with Kenny Omega and Kazuchika Okada with no time limit. This was their fourth time going head to head, and this time was special because Kenny Omega actually came out with the belt. He'd went up against Okada three other times, which are all stellar matches.
Yeah, that Wrestle Kingdom 11 match, Doug, was what caused Meltzer to break the
To break
tradition.
right.
Yeah, the 5-star system. He goes all the way to 7 stars on that one. So yeah, it's kind of like Flair Steamboat. You can pick any one of those and not go wrong. In fact, you probably should see all of them because they
Absolutely.
tell a story all the way through.
Yeah, and it's really cool because you have Kota Ibushi, who, what it comes down to in the storytelling with this is that Kenny acknowledging that Kazuchika Okada is the better wrestler, but Kenny is the better overall performer. And, building up to it, you have like Ibushi working with Kenny on his training, and Kenny comes in looking better than he has forever. You've got the Young Bucks. There's a bit of tension in the Bullet Club anyway at this point. So Ibushi comes out with him. The Bucks want to come out, but there's a great promo piece, trailer. I don't even know what you call it. It's not even an intro. I mean, it's very theatric where you have Kenny training, and there's this whole Avengers, which hi, big comic book. I mean, my God, I've got a Batman wall behind me, so that draws me into with the comic book Avengers Infinity War theme that they had going into it. But you had Kenny, the Ultimate Performer, versus Kota Ibushi. I'm sorry, not Kota Ibushi, who's amazing in his own right, by the way, but Kazuchika Okada, the Ultimate Wrestler, and Kenny came out on top and was finally that IWGP World Heavyweight Champion, and it took Okada's character in a different direction for a while too, which was very interesting. But that one I put these in no particular order, and yeah, and I'm just going to keep it that way. Mine are in no particular order, but that was just the
Wow.
last one I'm going to talk about.
I went chronologically, and I won't have to talk about the my final one because you just did. Okada. That, I mean, in modern wrestling, it is the series of and I could have at first I went Wrestle Kingdom 11, and then I started thinking about the series and the overall story. It's kind of like the Flair Steamboat thing.
It
It was
really is. Yeah.
and who were their ultimate opponents for the other, kind of like it was with Rock and Stone Cold earlier. I mean, there's just that one guy you seem to have even that much more chemistry with. And these two guys definitely had that chemistry right from the moment they locked up for the first time. And they told that story all the way through the match that you just spoke of, Doug. And for the American wrestling fans, obviously you now know who Kenny Omega is, but you still need, if you really want to know who Kenny Omega
Yes.
is, see these matches in New Japan. And if you don't know who Okada is, he is essentially to that country what HBK is over here. As far as I don't know that there's another wrestler on that stage that has shown brighter in those big matches. That whenever you're having your big headline event, whoever the opponent is, you want him on the opposite side of the ring of Okada because you know you're going to get yourself a classic match. And these two men delivered a classic match.
Indeed, they did. So,
All right, folks. I don't know if hopefully between my honorable mentions and Doug and I having 2 of our 5 in common, there you got at least 8 matches that you can go and hey, if you have a different 8, that's fantastic.
it's awesome.
You're not wrong. I mean,
Hey, let us know in the comments below. Maybe there's something we missed that
yeah, we want to know what you like, and so we can go watch it too. But there's so much wrestling in history that is worth going back and seeing from all the different eras that it's fun to debate about. It's fun to have these kind of conversations, Doug. And that's what made me so mad at first about the whole Edge Orton greatest match ever, because even if it had been one of no one could ever say that match you saw as a kid that turned you on to professional wrestling is any less than any of the ones we just talked about, because it's how you, at the end of the day, it's that match and how it made you feel. No one saw it but the couple thousand people that were there that night at the Logan Fieldhouse. But that match that I saw that day in the front row at like 13 years old is still the greatest match I ever saw, even though very few people will ever see it. And that's what makes this form of entertainment great.
Indeed, it does. Well, brother, let's head to our big finish. How about it?
Let's do it. Let's get let's go embarrassment of the week, Doug. This is something that you had actually mentioned last week when we were doing our 1 year take on AEW, and you had it listed as a negative, and I'm putting it as my embarrassment of the week. Mike Tyson got involved with AEW, and honestly, while I'm not a fan of celebrities getting involved, there are a few exceptions in wrestling history, but I also get it. I mean, from the time that Muhammad Ali got involved with Gorilla Monsoon, or it's always been a part. I remember even as a kid hating it when Mr. T was going to be in the main event of the first WrestleMania. I'm like, why is Mr. T not able to beat a wrestler? Because these guys, whatever. If you're going to go there, go there. The Tyson thing happened and they barely mention it. Now, like, if you're going to set it up, at least finish it all. I agree it was not good, but this week it didn't even get mentioned once. And so to me, that shows a lack of follow-up, and that's something that AEW is usually really, really good at. Maybe they dropped it, and maybe that's for the best, or maybe the coronavirus situation has them having to prolong it more than what they thought. But if you're going to have a big angle like that to try to get eyes on the product from the regular sports world, at least do your follow-up.
I have to agree with you because I'm certain that that's happening at All Out. We're going to see Jericho versus Mike Tyson with his squad of MMA buddies from Las Vegas, and Jericho with the Inner Circle minus Sammy Guevara, because I don't see Sammy getting reinstated anytime soon.
No.
But if ever, but. Yeah, I'm with you. I'd never really like the I get it. I understand the point is to bring more eyes to the product, but and follow up is key. We've talked about that before too. But there's zero follow up. Although I'm loving the program with Orange Cassidy right now, loving that. Although I'm not sure how he got a bloody ear out of a fight with Jericho. it wasn't quite that Becky Lynch, busted nose imagery, but it still looked kind of cool. We got a comment. Hold on.
Yeah, pull that one up, folks, because that is absolutely another match that it's not going to be one of those matches that is a technical masterpiece. It was not a mat classic because it didn't take place on the mat. But you talk about a memorable match that had that people still talk about to this day, partly because it's one of the reasons that Jim Cornette still has a limp. But the Road Warriors versus the Midnight Express. No one at that time had ever seen anything quite like that. This was before Mick falling off Hell in the Cell and those sorts of things. You'd get an occasional cage match. And to this point in wrestling, about the biggest bump you can imagine is Jimmy Snuka coming off the top of that cage at Madison Square Garden. So good call, Scott, because that is definitely one from my childhood that I remember. And I realized I did not, as much as I love tag team wrestling, at the end of the day, when I had to list it, narrow it to 5, I found myself going like single performer a lot. Right. So I'm glad that you brought that up in another tag team classic to bring into the mix. But Doug, what was your embarrassment this week?
So, man, it really isn't necessarily. I mean, it's wrestling related, but it's just embarrassing how WWE has handled this pandemic, from being somehow magically deemed a essential service back when things were starting to really ramp up, to this week, when we're finding out, upwards of 24 of their employees in Orlando are COVID positive. They brought in friends and family to be in the audience to kind of mix things up a little bit. We just need to be safer. I mean, Triple H talking about how they don't test, but all the methods they've had up to this point will work and work well. Well, we have like the UFC, AEW, actually testing and making sure that the people who are there performing aren't positive. And I know tests aren't always 100% accurate, but at least they're testing. They're trying, where we have WWE just bringing people in with no masks, having everybody at ringside, and it's just an embarrassing situation that I wish people would get on board with. We need to stay safe, because this is not going anywhere. And I'm not going to start preaching about that, but that's just really, it's really got a bug in my craw this week, man.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And it's going to probably continue, because as all the major sports are, like, baseball finally came to an agreement this week, and they're getting ready to start, and they're heading to spring training. And before they even get to spring training, these guys are popping tests, like 4 or 5 of from this team. And that's going to be the story of this whole baseball season is, who is out with coronavirus. In fact, they've separated it from the regular disabled list that they normally have for regular sports injuries, in that, there's a COVID list they're going to have, because they know they're going to have so much of that. Now we're starting to see that in wrestling, and these guys don't want to stop production. AEW and WWE, they're in Florida, kind of in an epicenter right now, and they got weekly TV that they are, contractually obligated to be putting out, and they know that if they get too open and honest about what's happening with this, they don't get a handle on it, they are going to have to cease doing their weekly shows, and who knows what that looks like, ratings wise, economically, and all that. So I understand why they don't want to, but health is health. And so I'm with you. The performers and the behind the stage folks, the camera guys, the catering guy, all those folks need to be considered. So not to get on a rant, but I agree with you that's certainly an embarrassment. On the brighter side of things, how about a match this week? Do you have a match of the week?
I'm going with the NXT North American Championship this week, because all 3 of these guys, Balor, Gargano, and Keith Lee, are amazing performers, amazing wrestlers. And something that got my 4-year-old son to totally pop was when Balor is setting up for to take out Gargano, and Keith Lee just kind of comes up like Godzilla coming up out of the water right behind him. I mean, it's things like that he's 4 and he's popping for that. He's like, "Daddy, it's Godzilla. He looks like Godzilla." Like, yeah, buddy, he does.
He probably hits as hard as Godzilla too. You and I stood next to Keith Lee. That is a big dude.
That is a very big dude, man. But
they had a match, man. That was a great match.
I mean, it was, anything that, I mean, yeah, and that's what it's about, making memories, making the boys pop, How
So
about
for me,
you?
this week, whose house it was Swerve's house. Um, Isaiah Swerve Scott, when he was on the Independence, he was the world champion in MLW, and he got on my radar then as like, this is a guy to watch, and he is just now in the early phases of an NXT/205 career, and he and Tony Nese put on what will be a very underseen but a classic match nonetheless on 205, because I don't know how many people are actually watching
Okay.
205. But this match took up the whole broadcast, and they really had three matches in one. They started out with a filling out process, a technical match with some counters. Then they moved to the air and the high flying stuff. And then once the anger started bubbling through, the contest went from being sportsmanlike to being just a brawl. And in the end, it ended with a flurry of near falls. And so it just was really well put together, and great work by both men. So definitely check that one out, folks. You can see it if you have the network. A lot of folks may not watch 205. Check this one out on 205, because it's a 20-minute broadcast is all it is, and this is the only match that's on it. Worth your time. Doug, your performer of the week.
So I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go with Dynamite again. Shocking shock, but I know, right?
There in the name. Yeah.
It is right there in the name. But cousin Jack, the man formerly known as Jack Swagger, currently going by his actual name of Jake Hager. I thought his heel, he nailed the cocky, overconfident MMA fighter heel that his character is being built around. He nailed that in the promos for the upcoming Fighter Fest bout with Cody for the TNT championship belt.
Got it right.
I got to be careful with that, me and JR.
Yeah.
But I just thought I just loved that entire performance, coming out there with the swagger, no pun intended, and the cockiness. I mean, he shows up extra late for it and everything, and then the hold his fist to Cody, and yeah, I just thought it came together perfectly, and it's like, this is a great heel. Yeah, I know, I don't think it's going to go anywhere. Come Fighter Fest, Cody's going to retain that belt, but again. Cody will do what he can to elevate Swagger. Jake Hager, and it'll be a good match. But Cody will walk away with the belt. But I just love the cocky heel that's already you want to see him get his comeuppance. Already for just the very little that he did there.
So for me, I want to give a kudos to Edge for that incredible promo he cut on Raw, but ultimately I've waited to put this as my performer of the week, because if you haven't seen it again, and now Dynamite Doug over here on this side, or whichever way he is on your screen, but
okay.
Maybe I seem like I'm a WWE mark this week and WWE Network mark, but the series that the WWE Network did on The Undertaker, a 5-episode series, it finally concluded this week. My performer of the week is The Undertaker. This is the greatest docu-series that the WWE Network has ever produced. Regardless of what you thought of Taker when he first showed up, because I'm a kid who's an NWA fan who hated all the WWE gimmicks that were, cartoony in my mind. Here comes a guy who's dead. He's an Undertaker. And I thought, yeah, well, we've seen a hockey player and we've seen a garbage man, and now we got this gimmick. And I didn't like it. And then as wrestling evolved and changed, Mark Calloway took that character and evolved and changed and began selling, and so the supernatural elements were still there, but suddenly it had a more realistic tone. And then and he is the last of the greatest. He is the last of the gimmick wrestlers. Those things tended to not age very well. And for that man to have done it for 30 plus years, without a doubt, it's the greatest gimmick in the history of the business. And being old school, he is one of the last guys from that era to protect the character off screen. He wouldn't show up to the Hall of Fame the way that everyone else would year after year. He wouldn't do, a lot in the way of interviews where he was out of character, and as Mark Calloway. And so for an old school wrestling fan like me to actually see the man there with his family, talking about his injuries, his doubts, his self-doubts, It's just been a riveting each episode. I thought the first one was so good. I thought, man, I wish they'd have just stopped right there because, where do you go from this? And each episode was just as good as the one before. They finished it up this week. If you haven't seen it, the one this week takes it all the way to the end when he wrestles with AJ in that cinematic contest at this year's WrestleMania. I didn't know until I watched this that not only did the man pull off what he did in that match, but he had just lost his brother that like the day before that was filmed. I mean, just again, really in-depth stuff where you see the man behind the character, and it is so worth watching if you are a fan of this business at any point in the last 30 years, whether you're a fan of The Undertaker or not, the respect you have to have for the guy. And at the end of things, and of course, time will tell, Doug. We're going to talk in a future episode about walking away and why it's so hard for certain guys to walk away. But by the end, the man who did not know when to walk away has made it sound as if he is, in fact, wrestled his final match. So to sort of echo the hashtag out there this week, thank you, Taker. Thank you, WWE Network, for this behind-the-scenes look at this legend. And that's my performance of the week.
And I think that's also a perfect way to end this week. Yeah, we're right there. So,
right.
folks,
fans, next week we are off because of the holiday.
True story.
So enjoy your 4th of July, enjoy your hot dogs, your fireworks, and join us the following week because we're back into pay-per-view cycle, Doug.
It's never ending.
Tonight at 8 o'clock, we'll be previewing Extreme Rules.
Oh, yeah, with their haunted horror something or another, poorly named.
Now, Dynamite, don't give any spoilers just what you think about the product. Let them tune in 2 weeks.
I love all wrestling. I love all wrestling, and I love all of you all. So stay safe, stay off smart, wear masks, watch wrestling. Good night, everybody, and be kind to each other. Come on, it's not that hard, people.